Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. Tonight we have Marcia Zug here, and we're going to learn about You'll Do, Marrying for Reasons Other Than Love. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you, Marcia.
Hi. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for coming. The way I normally give this talk is I like to read a couple passages from the book to give you a sense of what the book's like, what's covered in it, and then I'll have a PowerPoint and I'll go through the chapters a little bit to show, what they're kind of all about. And I often start with why I wrote this book. So I'm a family law professor. I teach down at the University of South Carolina. I teach law, and particularly I teach family law. And I'm very interested in marriage in particular and why people marry. And part of that has to do with the fact that I've been teaching for a while now. And as part of my family law class, I'm always asking my students, what they think marriage does, right? What they think it does legally, because it's a law class. And one of the questions that I ask them every year is how many federal benefits? So there are two types of benefits that can attach to marriage. You can have federal benefits, you can have state benefits. So I ask them, how many federal benefits do you think attach to marriage? And over the years, the number they say has been going down and down. And this year, when I asked, first kid who raises his hand, he says 12. And then someone else shouts out 25. And then maybe I get a 30. And then I stop them because there are well over 1,000 federal benefits alone that attach to marriage. And what I've realized is there's this giant disconnect between certainly what my students think marriage does and what marriage actually does legally. And the other part of it that's going on is we have, a decline in marriage rates. Whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing is something we can talk about, but it's certainly happening. And one of the reasons that it may be happening is because people don't know what marriage actually does, right? If you think that marriage has a dozen benefits that attach to it, well, it's very reasonable that you might think that either A, you can contract for them, or B, you don't need them. They're not ones that you want. So when people realize what marriage does, they have a better sense of whether or not marriage is something that they want to get involved in. Because the thing that I'm hearing from my students all the time is that marriage is about, it really is, it's a private relationship. And you don't want the government involved in it, but the government's involved in it regardless. If you enter into this legal contract, if you don't enter into the legal contract, then you don't have the rights and protections that come with marriage. So a lot of this book was to explain what marriage actually does, why it does that, why these rights and benefits attach to marriage. The other part of it was that I have, a personal relationship to this. Not my husband. I say that in the dedication that, I apologize that people might think that this is why I married him. But I'm going to read you a part from the introduction, which talks about a family story of mine that sort of inspired the book. And then I want to read you a passage from the last chapter, which is the sort of story that I was collecting before I wrote this book, and is like 50% of the reason I wanted to write this book is because I have so many good stories about people getting married that I wanted to put them somewhere. I wanted to share them. So I'm going to start with the introduction. And as I mentioned, You'll Do is inspired by a family story. So You'll Do was inspired by the marriage of my great Aunt Rosie, a brave woman who didn't marry for love. In the late 1930s, Rosie was working in a garment factory on Manhattan's Lower East Side. Like most of the workers, Rosie was Jewish. Her best friend in the factory was also Jewish, and both understood the dangers posed by the rise of fascism in Europe. Rosie and her friend were safe, but her friend's brother Saul was not. Saul lived in Poland, and as the Nazis rose to power, Saul's family began to fear for his life. They desperately sought to bring him to America, but the U.S.'s draconian immigration restrictions severely limited the immigration of undesirable groups such as Jews. Saul was stuck. America would never grant his immigration application, with one exception: marriage. The only way to get Saul out of Poland and save his life was to marry him. So that's what Rosie did. In late 1937, Germany was preparing for war. Rosie left the safety of America to marry a man she had never met and save his life. Saul entered the United States in September 1938. He moved in with Rosie, They had a daughter and fell in love. Rosie and Saul's story has a happy ending, yet it's a tale that haunts me. If Rosie hadn't married Saul, he almost certainly would have died in a Nazi concentration camp. Marriage saved his life, but only because a racist U.S. immigration law denied him entry in the first place. You'll Do is full of similar stories. Stories that show how generations of American men and women have used marriage as a loophole to circumvent unfair or discriminatory laws. Unfortunately, not all these marriage stories are as admirable as Rosie's. You'll Do reveals how the rights and benefits that attach to marriage can also perpetuate harms. My family has a second, darker marriage story that falls into this category. Many years ago, one of my relatives lived with his wife and daughter. The daughter was mentally disabled. It may have been a birth injury. And after her birth, the couple was unable to have more children. This caused them great sorrow, and when their daughter was grown, they paid a man to marry her and provide them with a grandchild. The marriage took place nearly a century ago, and the daughter's capacity to consent does not appear to have been an issue. The two were legally married, and shortly thereafter, the daughter fell pregnant. Then, having fulfilled the terms of the bargain, the husband disappeared. 9 months later, the daughter gave birth to a healthy baby. The second story is about marrying for money, but it's also about marrying for parenthood and for criminal and legal protections. Marriage provided the husband with money while also protecting him from criminal prosecution for rape. There really isn't any other way to describe it. In addition, the marriage gave the grandparents their longed-for second child and protected the child from the legal taint of bastardry. The specifics of my family story are unique. However, their instrumental use of marriage is not. I have a neighbor who married to lower his university tuition, two friends who married for tax breaks, and a colleague who married for a green card. And these four are just the ones who have told me about their non-love reasons for marrying. Presumably, I know many others. Chances are you do as well. Perhaps a non-love reason even motivated your own marriage. So that gives you the background, the family background on why I wanted to write this. I've been fascinated by the different reasons, these instrumental uses of marriage. And the way the book is broken down is we've got two chapters on marrying for money. That's the most common one. If you think about people marrying for something, money is the reason that always comes to mind. So I broke that up into two chapters. The first chapter is the historic account of marrying for money. The last chapter is the modern version. I'm going to read a part from that as well. Then I also have a chapter on marrying for government benefits, marrying for status and power, marrying for criminal defense, marrying for parenthood, and again, like I said, the last one is on marrying for money, modern examples. So I'm going to read a part of that last chapter as well, and then I will turn to the PowerPoint. So in 2007, the following post appeared on an online message board from a woman seeking a rich husband. What am I doing wrong? Okay, I am tired of beating around the bush. I am a beautiful, spectacularly beautiful, 25-year-old girl. I'm articulate and classy. I'm not from New York. I'm looking to get married to a guy who makes at least $500,000 a year. I know how that sounds like a lot, but keep in mind that $1 million a year is middle class in New York City, so I don't think I'm overreaching at all. Are there guys who make $500,000 or more on this board? Any wives? Could you send me tips? I dated a businessman who makes average $200,000, $250,000, but that's where I seem to hit a roadblock. $250,000 won't get me to Central Park West. I know a woman in my yoga class who is married to an investment banker and lives in Tribeca, and she's not as pretty as I am, nor is she a great genius. So what is she doing right? How do I get to her level? How do you decide marriage versus just girlfriend? I am looking for marriage only. Please hold your insults. I am putting myself out there in an honest way. Most beautiful women are superficial. At least I'm being upfront about it. I wouldn't be searching for these kinds of guys if I wasn't about to match them in looks, culture, sophistication, and keeping a nice home and hearth. The poster then received the following answer. I read your posting with great interest and have thought meaningfully about your dilemma. I offer the following analysis of your predicament. Firstly, I'm not wasting your time. I qualify as a guy who fits your bill. That is, I make more than $500,000 per year. That said, here's how I see it. Your offer, from the perspective of a guy like me, is plain and simple a crappy business deal. Here's why. Cutting through all the BS, what you suggest is a simple trade. You bring your looks to the party and I bring my money. Fine, simple. But here's the rub. Your looks will fade and my money will likely continue into perpetuity. In fact, it is very likely that my income increases, but it is an absolute certainty that you won't be getting any more beautiful. So in economic terms, you are a depreciating asset, and I am an earning asset. Not only are you a depreciating asset, your depreciation accelerates. Let me explain. You're 25 now and will likely stay pretty hot for the next 5 years, but less so each year. Then the fade begins in earnest. By 35, stick a fork in you. So in Wall Street terms, we would call you a trading position, not a buy and hold. Hence the rub, marriage. It doesn't make good business sense to buy you, which is what you're asking. So I'd rather lease. In case you think I'm being cruel, I would say the following. If my money were to go away, so would you. So when your beauty fades, I need an out. It's as simple as that. So a deal that makes sense is dating, not marriage. By the way, you could always find a way to make your own money, and then we wouldn't need to have this difficult conversation. With all that said, I must say you're going about it the right way. Classic pump and dump. I hope this is helpful, and if you want to enter into some sort of lease, let me know. Okay, so one of the things that I like about that last passage is it has this assumption that a woman who marries for money is doing it despite the fact that she could make her own money. So at least historically, that isn't the case. So I want to start with, let's see. Hopefully this is full screen. I'm not sure. Uh,
It still shows the sides on the left so far, but I mean, it's totally fine.
mm, I'm not sure why it's not doing that, but at least you can see it. Okay, so historically, marrying for money was fine, right? When you hear about it today, you hear about this idea of the gold digger, and the gold digger has a negative connotation, and it's the idea of someone who's tainting marriage, right? By putting money into the marital relationship. That's a new idea, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But historically, the idea of marrying for money was 1,000% fine. It was expected. That's what women were supposed to do. Why were women supposed to do that? Because women could not make their own money. So the marital bargain was the idea of marriage as this exchange, right? Women would bring their wifely services to the marriage, right? Their looks, their youth, their fertility, their their housekeeping skills, cooking, cleaning, raising children, having sex, all of those things were what women brought to the marriage. And in return, men promised to take care of them, right? Financially take care of them. And given that women did not have another option and that this is what women were expected to do, marrying for these reasons was encouraged. It was considered the marital bargain. There's no negative connotation with it. There was also no fear. Now, part of the reason there was no fear about it was this doctrine called the doctrine of coverture. So initially, the concern about gold digging was not about gold digging women. The concern historically about gold digging was about men. And the reason for that was because if a man in the past, we're talking 18th and 19th centuries here, under the doctrine of coverture, once a woman got married, she was considered legally covered. That's what coverture means. Legally covered by her husband. So any money that she brought into the marriage would be his. Any money that he brought into the marriage would be his. So a woman marrying for money did not exist. You could marry a rich man. You could hope that share his money with you, but you couldn't make him. That's not the case with men. So if a man married a rich woman, all of her money becomes his. So there was a real concern about these like shady gold digging men marrying innocent, naive women and stealing all their money and ruining them. So your first anti-gold digging laws were directed at that. And you had a couple different ways that, the early states tried to prevent male gold diggers. One was age of marriage laws, right? There was the idea that young women would be more susceptible to the, I don't know, wiles of older men. And therefore, we needed to make sure that their parents were involved in these relationships, and therefore their parents could prevent them. As the mother of two teenage daughters, I don't necessarily think these 19th century parents were wrong in worrying about the, I don't know, decision-making skills of teenage girls. So age of consent was one of the issues. The other one was I don't know if you've ever researched incest laws in America, but one thing you would find out is that most of the states that allow cousin marriages are on board. They're the original 13 colonies. And a lot of this, these were the first states, and these were actually anti-gold digging laws. The idea was if we can keep it in the family, we don't have to worry about it, right? So there was the idea that we should marry our cousins because we know, right, who they are, and that's going to keep the money in the family. We don't have to worry about that. Neither of these were that effective. What was effective were the early Married Women Property Acts. And you've probably heard about these, but you've probably heard about them as early feminist legislation. And that's often how they're discussed these days, but they were not. They were anti-gold digging legislation. And the first, I live in the South. We don't usually have a reputation for being at the forefront of women's rights, and this was no exception. The reason that Mississippi passed the first Married Women's Property Act was, what did the South have? They had large plantations, and they had lots of enslaved people. And what was happening was a lot of these plantations had a single daughter, and their fathers were very worried about these gold digging men marrying these girls and ruining the family fortunes, driving the plantation into the ground, selling off the enslaved people, and ruining the family, right? So the Married Women's Property Act was passed to ensure that rich heiresses that married questionable men, or well, any men, could keep their money, that the men couldn't get at their money. And this was extremely successful. This actually ended male gold digging. If you could not get at your wife's money, then gold digging was a very risky proposition. And I have a story in here about a rich heiress and her gold digging husband, who he spends about 10 years courting her. He outlasts all the other suitors. He finally convinces her. She's not so sure she wants to get married. She understands what might happen. He eventually wears her down. He follows her all around Europe, declaring his love forever. So she eventually says, yes, I'll marry you. Fine. He wins. He thinks he's about to be rich. On the night before their wedding, she hands him a prenup, which basically does what the Married Women's Property Acts do. And it says that he will not have any control over her money if they get married. She has very good lawyers. And he throws a fit. He initially refuses to marry her, and none of that works. She says, I'm not marrying you unless you sign this. And he thinks, I'm charming. I'll convince her. After we get married, she'll turn over her fortune to me. He is right, but it takes him about another decade. So first he tries being really nice. She enjoys that he's really nice, but that doesn't convince her to turn over her fortune. Then he starts being really annoying. So I have a whole bunch of conversations that they have where like he's sulking that he won't have dinner with her because he doesn't own any of the wine. She suggests, why don't we go for a carriage ride? And he's like, well, but I don't horses. She's like, too bad for you. Eventually he leaves her. She's like, bye. That didn't work. So he comes back. He eventually annoys her so much that she leaves him. That's a problem because we're talking mid-19th century here. So a wife leaving her husband is bad. There's a lot of pressure on her from her family. She eventually agrees to come back home and share her fortune with him. So she gives him half her fortune. The next day, she immediately regrets her decision. They spent another 10 years in litigation. He eventually wins, but he wins after about 30 years. So does he win? James Fenimore Cooper actually wrote a book about this saga. It's a fictional book, but he's friends with the gold digging husband. And he is so appalled by this that he comes out as a very staunch opponent of the Married Women's Property Acts because it will make men have this problem, as which he has seen firsthand. So once you have Married Women's Property Acts, you get rid of the men. But that doesn't solve the marrying for money problem on the woman's side, because women, some of them are rich, but most of them are not rich, right? So most of them come into marriage without anything. And if you come in without anything, under the doctrine of coverture, everything that you earn is your husband's. Now, this was cartoons about, this is super problematic for women, but there are some benefits with this understanding of the marital bargain. And some of these benefits have to do with the idea that if there's a recognition of marriage as this economic exchange, then the courts are willing to recognize women's economic harms in marriage. So this is a picture of a breach of promise to marry suit. And a breach of promise to marry suit is where it's going to usually be a woman at the time, sues for the man for calling off the engagement because of the economic harms that it causes her. So when you have marriage as this economic, the courts are willing to look at the benefits and the harms in marriage in economic terms. So the women aren't considered gold diggers for this. They're not looked down upon for doing this. But what starts to happen in the 19th century is there is a pushback on talking about marriage as an economic bargain because it doesn't help women in the day to day, right? So what feminists of the late 19th century start hitting on as the solution to women's very vulnerable position in their relationships is love, right? That women have no power under the doctrine of coverture. And yes, we can fight for women's rights, but that seems fairly far off. So what we need is to push for a love match. So love was seen as the solution to abusive husbands. But love is going to be one-sided. Men can marry for love, but women can't marry for love because women still can't work. Women still need to marry for economic security. But the rise of the love match displaces this idea of the economic bargain. So now women are still marrying for money, but they're not allowed to talk about marrying for money. Women have to talk about marriage as also just about love. And we're going to see this again when we get back to the modern implications of this and where this, but this is the origin of both the love match and also the distaste for any economic damages in marriage. So that's the first chapter. The first chapter is on this historic marrying for money. Second chapter is on marrying for government benefits. This drawing, you see a young woman married to a very old veteran. Some of the first, really the first government benefits that attached to marriage, and really some of the first government benefits at all, were widows' pensions. And initially, they start with the Revolutionary War and the widows from the Revolutionary War. And then you get them for the widows of Civil War veterans. And first, they are for women who were married to Civil War soldiers when they were fighting. That's a limited number of people. Then they change it and they say that any woman who is married to a Civil War veteran would be eligible for a widow's pension. So what happens? This happens, right? All of a sudden, these young women start hanging out at the VFWs and looking for old guys who are close to death. And the idea is they will marry them, they'll put in a couple of years taking care of them, and then they will have a widow's pension for life. Congress knew this was happening. If you look at the debates around the extension of the widows' pensions, you have a couple senators who are like, these women are gold diggers. They're just looking for old guys to marry so that they can have this pension for the rest of their lives. And their colleagues said, yes, that is true, but this actually isn't a plan. It takes care of the needy soldiers or needy veterans who are old and we don't have any social security, social safety net. And these women, the women who do it, these are not women who are in great economic circumstances, right? If you're thinking about doing this, you're fairly desperate to begin with. So this is also how the government decides that they're going to take care of needy women. So this sets up the idea that the way we're going to take care of needy women in our society is through marriage. And I have a bunch of stories of these Civil War widows. I don't know if there's been a recent one, but for a long time in the early 2000s, the last living Civil War widow kept dying. And the reason there kept being a new one is because there were these women who had married really, really old men. And you would think that like in, 2010, there wouldn't be any more Civil War widows, but there were. So these are women who mostly married during the Great Depression. They married very, very, very young, a lot of teens, and they married 80, 90-year-old Civil War vets, and they did it for the money, for the pensions. And the men knew it, the women knew that this was happening, and the government knew that this was happening. Okay, so this was a choice. As I mentioned, Congress knew that women were marrying these men for their widowship. And when you get to, the New Deal in the 1920s, 1930s, and we start debating how we are going to take care of people, right? What the social safety net will look like. There are two proposals. We have the Social Security Act, and we also have something called the Workers' Unemployment Insurance Bill. And the Workers' Unemployment Insurance Bill would have provided for everybody as workers. What the Social Security Act does, it excludes most of the jobs that women do and decides that we are going to provide for needy women as wives rather than workers. So men are going to be provided for as workers, but women are going to be provided for as wives. So this is a deliberate choice that is made. There was an alternate that they decide not to do. This is based on this already long-standing idea that the government wants to reward women for their work as wives, but not as workers. So this causes certain problems. If women are going to be paid as wives, well, not all women get married, right? So there's now a tension, which still exists, and we can talk about that too, between married women and single women. So especially in the 1930s, right, where women are already getting paid much less than men. Single women are saying married women shouldn't work. They're getting taken care of another way. They're taking our jobs, and we have no other way to support ourselves. So one of the way that I work through the chapters, except for the first and the last, which mirror each other, each chapter I give you the history, and then I talk about the modern iterations of a lot of these issues that start in the 19th century and how we still see them today. One of the things that's perhaps surprising is that the majority of American women still receive Social Security today as wives rather than as workers. And it's estimated that that is expected to do that the majority of women, I think, through 2050, and a substantial amount of women through 2080. So we have built into our system the idea that we expect and we want women to be taken care of through their roles as wives and mothers rather than as workers. Chapter 3 is on marrying for status and power. There are a number of different ways that this happens. The Bridget Jones movie, one of the things, if you've seen it, she talks about smug marrieds. And she's hitting on this idea that being married is a preferable status to being single, right? And there's a long history of that. This history of spinsters. Spinsters were these sad, lonely women who we all felt sorry for. Actually, historically, we were much more concerned about bachelors. So we felt sorry for spinsters, but we were scared of bachelors. And a number of states, including Connecticut, had anti-bachelor laws. Unmarried men themselves, they were scary. We didn't like them, that they needed to be taken care of. And it was this idea that there's something a little off about unmarried men. You want them married. That's how they show that they are stable, responsible citizens. And there's a lot of letters and stuff amongst the founding fathers talking about this. I have letters from George Washington to his nephew, basically saying, get married so that you can show that you're a man. Now, these are the Adamses, John and Abigail Adams, and they have a very interesting exchange where they talk specifically about how marriage is going to be the way, not only that men and women gain status, because marriage is a higher status, but it's also going to be the way that both of them gain political power. So men are going to show that they are qualified for wielding political power by being married, right? A married man is head of his family. That shows that he is qualified to be head of a town, a state, the country. And women will have their political power through their role as wives. Now, Abigail is not so sure about this. She has a very famous letter to her husband where she asks him to remember the ladies. She's aware of his plan that women will basically be represented by their husbands. And she says, John, Not all men are as wonderful as you and respect their wives and listen to them. Some men are tyrants and will not vote or protect their wives' interests. So I beg you to remember the ladies and give them the power of their own. And John writes back, I hear you, Abigail. Everything you're saying makes sense. I'm just not going to do it, thereby proving her point. We also have another famous, 18th century couple, the Hamiltons. If you've seen the musical, my favorite song in there is the one that Angelica sings about the Schuyler sisters, basically saying that Hamilton just wants a Schuyler sister. He doesn't actually care which one. And that's because the Schuylers are a politically powerful family. His name, he's nothing, right? Family wise. And he knows that the best path to political power for him is through marriage. So long history of that as well. Um, some of the other interesting parts in this chapter have to do with marrying for racial status. Again, I live in the South, and we tend to remember, or we tend to think about race relations a lot of times in relation to Jim Crow and drop rule and real segregation. But earlier in the pre-Civil War period, marriage was actually a way that people could change their racial status. This is a political cartoon. Kentucky Senator who has two daughters with an enslaved woman named Julia Chin. He never frees her. But he does want his daughters to be accepted into white society, and this actually causes major problems for him in Kentucky. And they don't love this about him. It hurts his political career, but he insists on it, and it works. So he marries his two mixed race daughters to white men. And after that, as soon as he does it, you can look at the census records, their race changes from black to white. And there are lots of stories of this in which people who it's not necessarily, I mean, it works for passing as well, but these stories aren't about passing. These are people who everyone knows what their racial status is, but how marriage can actually change it. Then I talk about how marriage still works for power and status today. One of the areas where it is still perfectly permissible to discriminate against people is in marital status, right? It's perfectly reasonable, perfectly allowed, maybe reasonable is legal, perfectly legal to say, I don't want to rent to single people. I want to give discounts to married people. That type of discrimination is accepted, right? And there's a lot of also much more subtle discrimination. Sometimes when I give this lecture, the hardest facts that I give that people get a lot of pushback on has to do with the fact that there are a lot of studies showing that the lives of the married are treated as more valuable than the lives of the unmarried. And there are studies showing that you're less likely to be executed on death row if you're married than if you're single, showing that you get stronger, more aggressive cancer treatments if you're married than if you're single. So there's this, not only is there this long history of power and status coming from marriage, but it is continuing today. And there are lots of different ways in which I talk about how it shows up. Next chapter is the one that's often most surprising to people, is on marrying for criminal defense. And usually the first question is, well, what do you mean? What's an example of that? And child marriage is probably the most obvious example of that, right? Sex with children is illegal unless the child is your wife. And there is a slow movement to eliminate in this country, but there's a lot of pushback on it. And maybe surprising, maybe not. The picture on the left, the black and white photo, is of this couple from the 1920s. Their nicknames for each other are Peaches and Daddy. He marries her when he's in his mid-50s and she's 15. He was judging like a beauty pageant at her high school. And the reason he marries her actually is because we're just starting to have at that time criminal laws prosecuting people for sex with minors, and Daddy is getting looked at by prosecutors in New York City. So he marries and that ends the criminal investigation. It also ruins her life. And that's from the 1920s. The story on the or the picture on the right is she's also a child bride. She was forced to marry for immigration reasons. Her family wanted to bring over uh, a family friend, an older man, and the easiest way to get into this country is through marriage, and children can be forced into marriage. And there's a big movement to end child marriage as this loophole in which what would otherwise be a crime is considered okay. Some of the other examples, there's something called the heat of passion defense. I talk about this big trial from the 19th century. And the idea is that certain things are crimes, but they're less crimes if they're done by a married person, including murder. Right? So normally you can't kill someone, but if you kill someone for sleeping with your wife, that's maybe understandable, right? So that's invented in the 19th century, and this still exists today. I talk about a case from, I think it was 2012 in California, where there's a husband, his wife is cheating on him. He's upset about it. She says she'll stop. She doesn't stop. He decides he's had enough of it, so he calls the lover to meet him. They're going to hash it out. He brings a meat cleaver and hacks him in half. And, you know, he he is given a lesser sentence because his wife was cheating on him, so that was understandable. This is premeditated, gruesome murder, but because he's a husband, and we have this idea that certain crimes are less bad within the marital context, he's given a lesser sentence. Other examples of this have to do with various forms of domestic violence. I have lots of stories in the book about how crimes committed against a spouse are often given a much lesser punishment for these historical reasons that, well, historically, they weren't even considered crimes. Again, under the doctrine of coverture, there was no such thing as domestic violence because when a man and wife got married, they became one. And therefore, you could not beat yourself, you could not rape yourself. So there was no such there was no such crime. Today, those are both recognized as crimes, but still, in general, violence within a marriage is treated as less bad. Chapter 5 is on marrying for parenthood. This is a picture of Michael Jackson and Debbie Rowe. If you remember this marriage, you might remember, or you might have, like me, been somewhat surprised. I understood why he married Lisa Marie Presley, right? She's the king's daughter. He's the prince of pop, but I didn't understand why he married Debbie Rowe, who was, a dental hygienist. He married her to have babies with. And the reason he did this is because for men, historically and today, the best way to secure rights to your child as a man is through marriage. Whether or not Michael Jackson is the genetic father of those babies, who knows, doesn't matter, right? The way that you can automatically ensure that you are going to be the legal father of your children is through marriage. For men who are not married to the mothers of their children, a lot more risky, a lot harder, a lot easier to terminate their parental rights or just never have them exist in the first place. I have lots of stories too about how marriage helps men get custody in divorce cases. In general, mothers have an advantage in custody fights, but I have a whole lot of cases where I talk about when we have both two unmarried parents, but then the father remarries. You're not supposed to compare, you're supposed to compare dad to mom in a custody decision. You're not supposed to compare mom to stepmom. And a lot of these cases, that's what happens. So men who get custody tend to be remarried fathers who can then say often that they have a stay-at-home wife, and the courts start comparing now single working mom to stay-at-home stepmom. There are also a bunch of morality cases, right? If the courts have concerns about, extramarital sex, if one parent has gotten married and the other one's not, that parent is much more likely to get custody of the kids. So that goes into this idea from the 19th century that there's a certain way that women are supposed to be good mothers, and that requires them to, be in a marital relationship. So when women don't conform to the idea of the good mother, they can be compared against other women who are. And that's why a lot of times remarriage for men is the best way for them to get custody of their kids. Uh, I also talk about assisted reproductive technologies, things like IVF, uh, artificial insemination, different types of these new ways of making babies. Some of them historically, well, certainly historically, these technologies were limited to married couples. A lot of states still do that. That don't limit it. A lot of times they're only insurance companies will still only cover them for married people. So one of the strongest reasons today that people get married is for parenthood. They get married so that they can take advantage of these ways of getting pregnant, or that they can take advantage of, the insurance coverage that only applies to married people. And in addition, with adoption, there are a lot of states where it's almost impossible for single people to adopt. And even if it's not prohibited, there's a strong, strong preference. So I have all of these cases in this chapter about people who are thinking that they don't need to get married, marriage doesn't do anything for them, and then they try to have a baby and they realize it is so much easier if they get married. Last chapter goes back to marrying for money. So one of my favorite websites is this site called millionairematch.com. And millionairematch.com originally started as an anti-gold digging website. So the idea here was that you would sign up, you would send in your W-2s, which they would verify that you were a certified millionaire, and that everybody else on the site was also a certified millionaire. So you didn't have to worry about gold diggers. So the site gets launched, everyone signs up, all the millionaires are on the site, millionaires start looking around, and they decide that other millionaires are not attractive. So they then petition the site to have a separate section for those seeking millionaires, i.e. gold diggers, right? Which lets you know that the marital bargain is still alive and well today, right? What people seem not to want is to be duped, right? They don't want to think that a person's only interested in or they don't want to think that a person's interested in them not for their money and then find out that they're maybe only interested in their money. But if you're on a website and you go to the section of hot women interested in very rich men, you're not being duped. You know exactly what you're doing. And as that excerpt that I read, that's the exchange, right? You're bringing your money, they're bringing their looks or whatever, and it's an exchange. Everyone knows, everyone's happy. I think this website is fine. I think those marital agreements are fine. The ones that I worry about are the sugar daddy websites, because there's a big, big difference between marriage and not marriage, right? Marriage comes with protections for the end of the relationship. If you marry someone for money and then they leave you, you are entitled to lots of protections. You might have a prenup. I talk about prenups a lot, but even if you have a prenup, you know what's in the prenup. Sugar daddy websites are exploiting vulnerable women and providing them with no protections. So there, a lot of times, again, people don't realize the difference potentially between a sugar daddy relationship and a marriage. And again, it goes to not understanding what marriage does, the legal protections that come with marriage. So I'll end with the question of the future of marriage. I don't know. I started by talking about declining marriage rates. Many politicians are very, very concerned about declining marriage rates. They're also particularly concerned about the fact that declining marriage rates are connected to declining fertility rates. We are no longer at replacement numbers anymore. So we have a shrinking population, except for immigration. That's the only reason why we're not shrinking. So what we can expect to see, because this is what you see in countries where this is happening, are proposals to get people to marry and have babies. Whether or not these work is very questionable. Proposals include, various types of tax breaks and benefits that way, but they can also include, not just the carrots, but also the stick. There was talk, when when the push to overturn abortion, one of the benefits of that was seen as there will be more babies. There's a push right now to get rid of no-fault divorce. So the idea is that if you get married, it's for life. You can't get out of it, except for a few limited grounds. So we will see what happens. This is, a lot of the stuff that I follow and teach about. Um, how are how are we going to respond to potential fears about declining marriage and fertility? So I will stop there, and I am happy to answer any questions that you might have. And if not, thank you so much for coming.